Hello, my name is Spencer, and in my podcast called The Dictionary, I literally read from the dictionary, but add in my personal comments and stupid jokes to make it more interesting. Episodes are family-friendly, short, and air every single day on basically every podcast platform. Come join me on this journey filled with edutainment.
Hello and welcome to How Did This Not Get Made?
This is the podcast all about the movies you never saw, the scripts that were never filmed, and the ideas that never even made it to the page. My name is David Spencer.
My name is Daniel Kaka.
My name is Charlie Marlowe.
And my name is David Gansel.
Welcome back, everybody, to How Did This Not Get Made? We have two guests joining us today because this is a property we're talking about whose fans are extremely vocal and insatiable. We couldn't have just one of them on, so...
I hope not.
Are we doing another Zack Snyder thing again?
Joining us for their second time, Charlie Marlowe, welcome back. And joining us for the first time, he is, of course, no stranger to the Pipe Dream podcast family, and today is completing his Pipe Dream Infinity Gauntlet. And he also does a lot of awesome YouTube stuff under the name Doggins. Welcome to the show, David Gansel.
Completing my Infinity Gauntlet of currently active Pipe Dream podcasts.
Mm-hmm. If we ever, for some reason, do another episode of The Weird Alphabet, we're going to have to bring you on, David, because I know that you are the only massive Weird Al fan that we know that just never made it onto the Weird Alphabet.
What about Ella and I?
Oh, yeah. Well, let me rephrase that. David Gansel is the only person that we knew when we were doing the Weird Alphabet, and it is absolutely egregious that we never made time to get you on. And I feel ashamed of that to this day, to the point where I think you've already been on there, David. Before we get too much further into this just being Pipe Dream talking about Pipe Dream for an hour.
Is this month's Unclogged? What are we doing here?
Dan, what are we doing here?
We are talking about the video game and potential movie, The Curse of Monkey Island. Or more specifically, I guess just the Monkey Island franchise. So I want to just do like a round table here and just kind of ask everyone what is their history with Monkey Island. Charlie, let's start with you, our resident pirate.
It was the beginning of 2014, and I know because I posted on Tumblr right before I loaded up the game, be right back, gonna go get obsessed with Monkey Island.
And you were true to your word.
My favorite game as a kid was Pajama Sam, which is written by Dave Grossman, who is one of the co-creators of Monkey Island. And at the time, I had just gotten really into the Sam & Max games, which Dave Grossman was the head writer for the Telltale ones, and a lot of people who worked on Monkey Island worked on Sam & Max. And I just generally knew that this was the aesthetic and gameplay genre that I preferred. So I knew I would like it. I didn't expect 10 years later to only own pirate blouses, though.
Is it fair to say that this franchise basically created your identity? I feel like the first thing that I ever know about you is that you're into the pirate things.
It says on my bio on pipedreampodcast.com that Guybrush Threepwood transed my gender. That is correct. So the reason that I had played it, actually, I was editing a series of Sam & Max comic dubs. Sam & Max used to have little comics promoting the new LucasArts game in their newsletter, The Adventurer. We were about to dub the one made to promote Monkey Island 2. I was like, I would be better at editing this if I knew, like, music from the game that I could use.
Wasn't even to, like, get into a new thing. It was just for research for some other project.
Yeah, so I identify as non-binary. I was really struggling at the time with, like, I was practicing making my voice deeper. It's something I've been made fun of a lot, and I've been made fun of just generally for not having masculinity as a particular facet of myself. The main character, Guybrush Threepwood, his whole thing is that he's like way too confident and it's just completely unearned because it's, a 90s game, people trying to emasculate him. And he just like doesn't give a fuck. And I'm like, wait, hang on, that was an option? And it like completely rewrote my DNA, wow. I swear to God. So yeah, like most of the music I listen to now is sea shanties. My favorite movie is now Pirates of the Caribbean 2 specifically.
Yeah, Justice for Pirates 2.
My favorite TV show is Our Flag Means Death. Like, I don't own that many t-shirts anymore. I just moved across the world and I only packed like 3 t-shirts so I can like primarily wear pirate blouses.
That's great. Yeah. David, what's your history with Monkey Island?
I do own many t-shirts. The one I'm currently wearing is a Monkey Island t-shirt.
Amazing. I assume, Charlie, you are wearing one of your pirate blouses just because that is one of your 3 shirts.
Actually, I'm very tired today. So today I'm wearing my New York Renaissance Fair cast member t-shirt.
Fair.
I'm also wearing pajama pants with Jolly Rogers on them.
Oh, there you go.
Always on brand.
And that's like Pajama Sam, which it's all connected.
Yeah, there we go.
I just want to bring up that I guess 3 of us are wearing, or unless David is surprisingly wearing a on-theme t-shirt as well.
I am not wearing an on-theme t-shirt. This is one of the fun things that podcast listeners would often not get a chance to know about, but Dan always wears a t-shirt that is themed to whatever episode we are talking about.
So I grew up with mostly hand-me-down computers. I grew up with the Sierra adventure games, with the King's Quest games. I didn't discover Monkey Island until when we got the Phantom Menace PC game when it came out. There was a little catalog for all the other LucasArts titles available.
I remember not having the Phantom Menace game, but just having the demo and playing the demo, which was just the first level over and over and over again.
Just fighting those battle droids.
Yep.
I ultimately discovered Monkey Island through the catalog that came with that game for other LucasArts titles. This was in that sort of middle ground of LucasArts where they were still selling their old adventure games, even though they were definitely moving away from that genre.
Yeah.
So I found the page in the catalog of the Monkey Island series, and I was like, what is this? This looks intriguing.
Well, yeah, because they would have been changing from Windows 98 to Millennium Edition or XP or whatever, and those don't run 98 games or 96 games. So you would have to just re-release your games.
Yeah. It actually wasn't until college that I first actually got my hands on the games and played them all. Again, it's funny that I grew up on the King's Quest games when a lot of the impetus behind the Monkey Island games was Ron Gilbert saying, what if the King's Quest games weren't punishingly difficult?
The first one is like partially a King's Quest parody.
In part. If I had grown up with Monkey Island, I don't think I could have made the leap to King's Quest so easily, but growing up with King's Quest, Monkey Island was just pure joy to play start to finish.
Like going on vacation after being at work.
Yes, exactly.
David, what is your history with Monkey Island?
I have never played a Monkey Island game. I don't play a lot of video games in general, even though I feel like it's a game that I definitely would enjoy because I did grow up with the Humongous Entertainment, Pajama Sam, and Putt Putt and like those style point-and-click adventures. So I just never graduated to the version of that wasn't made for 6-year-olds. My only experience with that genre was for a much younger audience. Like, that would surprise me as well. Ron
Gilbert, the CEO of Humongous, is the main Monkey Island creator. So, like, it's all the same DNA.
Gotcha. I definitely know the reputation of Monkey Island, though. Like, it seems like anybody that I know that has played Monkey Island, it is one of their favorite things ever. It's either you don't really know what it is or you're obsessed with it. And it doesn't seem like it's the type of game where like people are just like, oh yeah, that was fun, and then forget about it. For whatever reason, it's the type of thing that sinks its hooks into people.
It's meat hooks.
Yeah,
Yes.
and creates like a really passionate fan base. Literally just yesterday, we were recording another episode of How Did This Not Get Made? And we mentioned to her, like, oh, we're going to talk about Monkey Island tomorrow. And she was so excited and jealous that she wasn't going to be a guest on it.
Well, we called dibs.
Yeah. Well, we've gotten this request multiple times before just because this is one of those well-known unmade movies.
Yeah.
Through the research, actually found out why so many people know about this, especially if you're a huge fan of Monkey Island.
Yeah. Dan, what's your history with Monkey Island?
I have not played Monkey Island. Also not fully aware of the fandom behind it, but after looking through everything, I can understand why. Definitely a fan of Pirates of the Caribbean, the ride and the movies. I was obsessed after the first one, and I saw the second and third one. I saw the midnight screenings of both of those.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that was back when I was young and vibrant and still full of hope.
Remember those days?
Charlie and David, for the two of us here who have not played the games, what makes Monkey Island so special?
I think one of the things that draws people in immediately is just the atmosphere and the immersive world, which was very influenced by the Pirates ride. You can't really talk about the history of Monkey Island without talking about Pirates of the Caribbean because they intertwine in many, many places.
I love comedy when it is intertwined with like really good world building. That completely encapsulates me. Even from the first game, which is definitely heavier on the comedy than the rest of them, when they talk about LeChuck not wanting to leave the governor alone and him going to die at sea and his ghost still wanting her hand in marriage, it's done with like complete seriousness, like a sailor telling you a legit ghost story that chills him to his core. It's that, plus it's just one of the funniest things I've ever experienced. There is a long bit in the first game where your character, Guybrush Threepwood, goes behind a wall, and then on the UI, you just see a bunch of point-and-click puzzles happen without you for like 5 straight minutes that you don't even get to witness. You just see the items that you're using and how you're using them described on the UI window.
It might have been the first game to really figure out how to use the format of gaming for its humor.
Gotcha. That's not even a very common thing, I feel like, where games play with the format. Like, I feel like that's something that movies are able to do really easily, but the only other game I can think of where like the format is part of the joke is the Stanley Parable. I feel like is a good example of this is humor about being a video game that could not be possible if this were not a video game.
Yeah, it's because the 3 writers are all programmers, and they thought they were writing placeholder dialogue at first.
With the first game especially, it is this push and pull where it does feel like a rich, fully realized world, but there's also a very lighthearted playfulness to the development because Lucasfilm Games at the time, their offices were just like a handful of people just making fun stuff together. It was this era where George had signed away the Star Wars video game licenses before he even founded LucasArts, so they weren't allowed to make Star Wars games.
Oh, interesting.
In a very, Marvel Studios-esque way. They had all these limitations on the stuff they already owned at Lucasfilm.
I remember hearing that a huge part of LucasArts was the Marsha Lucas divorce. Like, he did not want to make things for a while. Basically, yeah, these people just had way too much freedom. I heard in an interview with Ron Gilbert who's like, it wasn't like today where you officially like cut the ribbon and start production on a game. We just started working on things, and sometimes they turned into finished games that got released.
It was also just the right time for that sort of thing to be feasible because just the way computer games were at the time, you didn't need all this complicated development for the actual software of it the same way you would now.
Yeah. I think this is probably going to lead us naturally into Dan's notes, because I assume Dan's got some more stuff about the origins of the game.
Yeah, you're definitely hitting some points there. But before we get into the notes, we are going to take a little break to pay.
We needed to earn some pieces of 8.
There you go.
And we're back. Hopefully there was an ad for gold, because that seems to be very appropriate for this episode.
So let's talk about the history of LucasArts and Monkey Island.
The adventure game genre actually dates back to 1976 with the text-based adventure game Colossal Cave Adventure, which is commonly known as just Adventure, thus the genre adventure games. The game was a simple text-based story in which you controlled the outcome based on how you responded, which is usually a simple command. For example, they would just ask you like directions on where you need to go, and you'd have to respond with N, S, E, or W for north, south, east, or west.
And the fascinating way about how that gameplay style was developed was the person who created the game found it on a computer with just directions and descriptions of the environment with no other puzzles or anything, and just decided to add puzzles in, not knowing that that was a map of the Mammoth Cave system in Kentucky. And it is said that people who have memorized how to get through Colossal Cave Adventure can navigate the Mammoth Cave system their first time without any help.
That's fascinating.
So does the Mammoth Cave system also have a flask of Dennis? Or
I've been in those caves too. Wow.
Now you got to play that adventure game.
Now I do. Then the first time we saw graphics added was in 1980 with the game Mystery House for the Apple II. You'd still have to respond using text commands, but you'd get to see digitally with line drawing illustrations that accompanied the story. The next milestone in the genre was the 1984 King's Quest. This time the game included animated graphics to go along with the text adventure.
both Mystery House and King's Quest were the brainchilds of Roberta Williams, founder of Sierra.
Prior to those, there was a sort of remake of Colossal Cave Adventure for the Atari 2600 called Adventure, and the gameplay style of that is where the gameplay style of Legend of Zelda comes from. So that is kind of a cousin genre.
I feel like I remember the name Adventure on an entirely different kind of game. Now I know that it's all related. Mm-hmm. It's all connected.
Lucasfilm Games first entered the video game world with the adventure game Labyrinth, based on the Jim Henson film, which came out in 1986. In this, the user could choose from a selection of text commands rather than trying to guess on what to type, like with other adventure games before it.
Just the existence of Lucas Games is so interesting to me because I feel like in the last 15, 20 years, it's not uncommon for a movie studio to have its own games division. I feel like I haven't heard of any other thing like that before 2000. And the fact that George Lucas and Lucasfilm was jumping on that so early. I mean, it makes sense for George Lucas because he had his finger in a lot of technology things at the time.
Although he has never played a video game to this day, including the LucasArts games.
That doesn't surprise me, but it also doesn't surprise me that of everybody involved in movies, George Lucas was the guy who was like, yeah, I'll throw money into this whole computer game thing.
I think he lives like 20 years ahead of us.
So Lucasfilm Games seemed to be an innovator in realizing the genre when the next year they came up with Maniac Mansion, where the player could just click on any interactive object in the room and they would click to direct the character on where to go. From this, the developers created SCUM, which is an acronym for Script Creation Utility for Maniac Mansion. SCUM is what Lucasfilm Games would use to create most of their adventure games from there on.
Ron Gilbert would make games on it at Humongous Entertainment and then got sued by Lucasfilm Games.
Oh, wow.
I think he won that because he kept using it.
Yeah.
The game division of Lucasfilm was very small. It was only 8 developers. For George Lucas, he agreed to keep the video game branch open as long as they followed a few simple rules: stay small and don't lose money.
And how'd that work out decades in the future?
I'm sure it's fine. So, The Secret of Monkey Island is an adventure video game produced by Lucasfilm Games, released in 1990. In this game, you play as Guybrush Threepwood, who arrives on Melee Island in hopes of becoming a pirate. In the beginning, he blatantly says,
"My name's Guybrush Threepwood, and I want to be a pirate."
A very simple premise to follow, no notes. In his quest to become a pirate, he seeks various pirate captains on the island that provide him with swashbuckling challenges to prove that he is worthy of a pirate life. While on his journey, he hears tales of the ghost pirate LeChuck and falls in love with Elaine Marley. who just happens to be LeChuck's long-lost love interest.
Long-lost stalker victim.
LeChuck and his undead crew invade the island and kidnap Elaine, taking her back to their hideout, Monkey Island. Now Guybrush and his crew of characters that he's met through these challenges must set out to Monkey Island to save her, and while trying to deal with cannibals. There, he obtains a magic voodoo root elixir that he must use to stop LeChuck from marrying Elaine.
But don't worry, the cannibals are vegans. Morally, they're cannibals, but dietarily, they don't trust red meat.
Wait, is that an actual thing from the game?
That is an actual thing.
That's amazing.
That's really funny.
There's all these signs from everyone else who's staying on the island calling the cannibals uncivilized, and then when you actually meet them, they're like new agey Californians.
The game played so much with all the tropes of the swashbuckling genre. There are elements of the game that have not aged well. Voodoo is a big part of the game, and now that we have more of a cultural understanding, that is what it is. But as just a take on piratey tropes, it's just such a fun exploration of this world. Just the freewheeling nature of the way games were made at the time. The character Elaine Marley wasn't even named Elaine until pretty late in development. When
they decided the character was going to rush into a church and they're like, oh, they should make a The Graduate reference.
Exactly. When at the end you have to stop a wedding, so one of the dialogue options is just shouting, Elaine! And then they were like, well, I guess her name is Elaine now.
That kind of tongue-in-cheek humor has actually sort of always been a part of the adventure game genre, because there's a joke in Colossal Cave Adventure that I adore. You encounter a room where there's a dragon and you can't go through it until you defeat the dragon. So you type kill dragon and the game says, with what? Your bare hands? And the solution to the puzzle is to type yes. And then the game says, okay, you just killed a dragon with your bare hands.
That kind of like roundabout development, making things up as you go while actively programming the game, feels like something that can't be done the same way anymore, just with the way game development is.
Yeah.
The Monkey Island people talk about how voice acting really ruined it because you need a whole script of a game done at a certain point in production. Whereas before voice acting, up until like a month or two before release, there were rooms that just said insert puzzle here in text floating in the area.
I imagine it also has to do with just like how big game development staff is. You know, it used to be that you could have a team of less than 10 people make an entire game, and that doesn't exist for big studios.
Now you can have a team of 10 people make one model.
There's certainly indie games that are just, you know, one person, Stardew Valley being like one of the more famous examples of that. So I feel like that style of comedy and storytelling, like, has an opportunity to come back around. The old days of being able to just make whatever as you go could potentially be back in one form or another.
You know, the adventure game is not the dominant genre in gaming. It might have been in the Monkey Island oral history book that it's not so much that adventure games died out, it's just that every other genre of game became so much bigger, and adventure games kind of stayed at the same level sales-wise that they always were. Now that game studios have become such bigger investments than they used to be, they're not gonna bother wasting money the same way. Which is why adventure games mostly live on in the indie world. So, you know, thanks, capitalism.
Yeah. I think that the experience of playing an adventure game is still more similar to just watching a movie than other game genres necessarily are.
Part of the reason it went away also is that all games tell a story now.
That's true.
Yeah.
Text adventures like Colossal Cave Adventure, the community that still plays them hates the term text adventure and prefers interactive fiction. This is just a book you can play through. If books haven't died, why would interactive fiction?
And it's like so similar to an experience you can get with, you know, playing D&D or something like that as well. There's like a lot of crossover there.
Kill a dragon with what? Your bare hands? Okay, roll a strength check.
Just the culture of video games shifted as well. I feel like in the 80s and 90s, it was a more intellectual nerd type of person was the number one consumer, and then in the 90s it became kids more, and kids aren't going to sit and read a text adventure. They want to jump around and race go-karts and do that kind of thing. And then those kids have grown up into being a lot of the video game audience that wants the fast-paced action games. People don't want to just like sit and read an adventure. So much of video games has become about reaction speed more than any other skill, which is a bit of a bummer because there is a lot more you can do with video games than just see who can press buttons faster.
But yeah, the idea of Monkey Island came from the game developer Ron Gilbert in 1988, who just completed creating the games Zack McCracken, Alien Mindbenders, and Maniac Mansion, all for Lucasfilm Games, all of which were also point-and-click adventure games much like The Secret of Monkey Island. The idea was just one of many ideas that Gilbert came up with. At the time, he would write one-page video game ideas and he would just pass it around the office just to get feedback on it. So Monkey Island was just one of many ideas that he was just throwing at the wall just to see what would stick. David Gansel, I think, is looking up to see if he can find the original concept page that he wrote.
So I'm not sure if this is the original concept page, but it is the original outline for the first version of the game.
Okay, so that I did read, yes.
Okay.
Which was originally called the Mutiny on Monkey Island. The reason he wanted to do this is the Pirates of the Caribbean ride. As a kid, he always wondered what it would be like to step out of the boat and explore the world of that ride, and it is amazing that Disney did not sue them.
Well, the thing is, at the time, he does not borrow specific iconography from the Pirates ride in the first game. In the second game, there is a puzzle that is very directly referencing the Pirates ride.
One-to-one.
In which Guybrush is in a jail cell and needs to get a bone in order to lure a dog who has the keys to the jail cell.
You can keep doing that forever. The dog is never going to move.
Do you know what the name of that dog was?
Walt.
That wasn't because of Walt Disney. That was because that was Steve Purcell's dog. Steve Purcell, who made a lot of the pixel graphics, did the cover art, and created Sam and Max.
It was an overlapping coincidence.
Oh.
Because all of the dogs in the games, I think, are named after employees' dogs. It might have been, let's name this one after Steve's dog because Walt, haha, get it?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that was the explanation so that they weren't being hounded by the mouse.
Hounded. You could always tell if a Monkey Island fan had never actually been to Disneyland if they think that the Pirates movies took that from the game and the game didn't take that from Pirates.
Yeah.
I love hearing that it was because he wanted to step out of the ride and explore that world, because my limited familiarity with point-and-click adventures is that one of the best parts about it is that there are so many little details that it's fun to like, oh, what's this over in this corner? Let me try clicking on that to see if something interesting happens. And there's so many just little hidden details everywhere, which is one of the things about Disney rides, and, you know, especially Pirates of the Caribbean, has like all of these little scenes. If the boat was sitting in place and not moving, you could probably spend a lot of time just trying to point out as many little things you can find.
I can't remember any of their names offhand, but I found out there are actually a handful of people who have worked both for LucasArts and for Imagineering.
Yes, someone who designed some of the puzzles for Curse of Monkey Island also designed a scavenger hunt puzzle event relating to Pirates of the Caribbean.
It might have been the same person also worked on some stuff for Galaxy's Edge. So, you know, it all comes back to Disney and Lucasfilm eventually.
Let's go back into this. So one genre that Rob wanted to avoid was fantasy, which was very popular at the time, especially if you look at all of the fantasy movies that were happening throughout the 80s. It's just a weird time.
And so far, the text-based adventure games that you've already mentioned are all fantasy.
Yes, yeah. Instead, he thought that the game should be about pirates, and then he would try and like introduce some fantasy elements into the game instead of it being just a straight fantasy. More about the development of the game. Gilbert would write out his games like it was a short story, like we just mentioned before. And in the first draft of this story, the game was going to be titled Mutiny on Monkey Island, which we mentioned before.
Which is a great title.
Yeah. The pitch was well received by the developers at Lucasfilm Games, but the production had to be postponed in order to release the Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, the adventure game, in time for the film in 1989.
That Indiana Jones game is honestly incredible for the time because it follows the plot of the movie, but there are so many alternate solutions and branching pathways you can do to the point where you can follow most of the steps of the movie exactly, or you can do something completely different and you can skip entire sequences. Like, you can give the Nazis a decoy Grail diary and then not even need to go to Berlin. It's amazing that at that time they programmed a game specifically designed to allow you to skip like half of it.
It was the best-selling game that Lucasfilm Games had ever done, to the extent that to maintain Stay Small and Don't Lose Money, they had to make a sequel to it. So there is an Indiana Jones 4 that came out in the early 90s called The Fate of Atlantis, and you will still find some hardcore LucasArts fans commenting on Crystal Skull videos like, well, I grew up with the real Indiana Jones 4.
Now, were these like adventure games as well? Like the same kind of storytelling adventure?
They are almost identical to the build of Scum that is used in Monkey Island.
Okay.
It's just funny because now, Spielberg movies have had the high highs of the Last Crusade adventure game and the low lows of the E.T. Atari game in the same decade.
I imagine that like Indiana Jones is the perfect type of story for that genre.
Yeah.
After The Last Crusade was finished, the crew put together their entire efforts towards making Mutiny on Monkey Island. To help, Gilbert hired Tim Schafer and Dave Grossman. Tim Schafer was a database software engineer seeking a job at Lucasfilm Games. When he first applied, during a phone interview with David Fox, who is one of the founders of Lucasfilm Games, Tim stated that one of his favorite games was Ball Blaster. Fox informed him that the name of their game was actually Ball Blazer, and the pirated version of that game was Ball Blaster.
Don't copy that, Floppy.
He was not hired then, but they kept his resume on file. It might have helped that Schafer then sent the team a comic of himself getting a job at Lucasfilm Games and him getting hired, which might have led to Gilbert choosing him on the team.
That's got to be one of the biggest whiffs you can make in an interview, is to admit that you played the pirated version of somebody's game.
Well, what better person to work on a pirate game than
Oh, yeah, right?
Proving your credentials.
So the game drew its inspiration from old Errol Flynn pirate films, which is why there's a lot of sword fighting challenges that involve insults that are thrown at the opponents. Writer Orson Scott Card, who is the writer of Ender's Game, actually provided some of those insults while he visited Skywalker Ranch. At the time, he was writing game reviews for Compute Magazine.
So what has come up since then? There's a not fully confirmed rumor, but a suspected rumor that Orson Scott Card got most of those insults from his son and did not do most of the writing himself.
That is spectacular.
Another huge influence on the game was the book On Stranger Tides by Tim Powers, as well as Sid Meier's Pirates was already huge for computers. There were some attempts to include inspiration from that didn't really pan out, that more fit into Curse of Monkey Island later. But if you go to the Wikipedia article for either Sid Meier's Pirates or On Stranger Tides, bizarrely, the first review on both is by Orson Scott Card.
Weird. That's so weird that Orson Scott Card wrote insults for this. Orson Scott Card, who is not a great person in real life, although that book Ender's Game was like my favorite book as a kid before I knew much about the real life Orson Scott Card. It's also weird to me because I just read a Marvel Iron Man comic that was written by Orson Scott Card that is very, very strange and bizarre, and it was also weird. It was like, why is this guy writing comics?
The most quintessential insult from the series is, you fight like a dairy farmer, to which the comeback is, how appropriate you fight like a cow, which supposedly is something Orson Scott Card came up with when he was like a little kid.
I remember the first time playing the game and it got to the credit, insults written by Orson Scott Card. I couldn't tell if that was a real credit or if it was like a joke credit. like
The man does have a lot of experience slinging hate speech. So I guess writing insults makes sense.
But back just to touch on Stranger Tides. So the reason why they use that as inspiration is because with the main character, Guybrush, they figure that he is kind of a fish out of water character, which is perfect for this game just because you as a person going into this world, you're also a fish out of water in this pirate universe.
I get it.
Yeah.
Out of water, pirates.
I will say that this season of How Did This Not Get Made is very nautical themed. We talked about Napoleon. Oh, we're going to do Popeye in the future. It's a lot of nautical stuff.
How did this not set sail?
Yeah. Yeah, and it also provided a lot of like paranormal themes in the game's plot.
If you read on Stranger Tides, the villain of that is like 1-to-1 exactly LeChuck. Like it's borderline plagiarism.
They seem to be stealing a lot of stuff from everything else and then just throwing it into the game and hoping that no one will notice.
And then just fully admitting it in interviews, actually.
Because games were seen as a lesser medium than like books or movies, it was just accepted that in a game, you could just do someone else's joke. There's a running gag where Guybrush will refer to something as like, that's the second biggest skull I've ever seen, which was a running gag on Get Smart.
It's the second biggest arrow I've ever seen.
So another obvious inspiration for the game we've talked about before is Pirates of the Caribbean. I do have a quote from Gilbert talking about it. So he says, quote, "The Pirates of the Caribbean ride keeps you moving through the adventure, but I've always wished I could get off and wander around, learn more about the characters, and find a way onto those pirate ships. So with The Secret of Monkey Island, I wanted to create a game that had the same flavor, but where you could step off the boat and enter the whole storybook world." So for the main character's strange name, Guybrush Threepwood, that came from the brainstorming session of the main character. There was an idea thrown out where the player would be able to choose a male or female main character, but there wasn't enough disk space to handle doubling the animation. You basically have to create a whole new game to take up the space of the original. During the brainstorm, the team would refer to the characters as brushes. Nowadays, we would just call them sprites. The name came from the drop-down menu in DPaint, which was the software they used to draw and color the characters and objects.
Steve Purcell specifically titled the file Guybrush. Steve Purcell, who is the indie comic creator of Sam & Max and also works for Pixar now.
Oh.
He did additional writing for Cars and voiced the tractors.
So the team had come up with the female's name first, and then Rob had asked, what do we call the Guybrush? And someone piped in, well, what about Guybrush? And the others liked the name and thought it was clever. As for the last name, Threepwood, that came from the P.G. Wodehouse novel, The Brinkmanship of Gilead Threepwood.
The protagonist of On Stranger Tides, I'm blanking out on it, but his surname is a very similar sound to Threepwood. I think it was Ron Gilbert like, I'm just going to pull a similar last name from a different book I read, so I'm not directly ripping it off.
That makes sense.
I love that the name Guybrush is named as a similar convention to another popular Lucas character, R2-D2, which comes from grabbing Reel 2 Dialogue Track 2.
Yes!
Or R2-D2. And then they're like, hey, let's call the robot that.
So in 1989, Ron Gilbert wrote an article for the Journal of Computer Games Design called Why Adventure Games Suck, which led to a lot of basic rules on how his adventure game, Monkey Island, would be designed and address the frustrations players encountered when playing previous adventure games. So here's a few of the basic concepts. The end objective needs to be clear. Sub-goals need to be obvious. There's the live and learn, so meaning that there is no deaths to the main character. There's backwards puzzles, so don't give the player a solution before presenting the problem. For example, if a character falls into a hole, you have to present that there's a rope that will help get them out. There's the forgot to pick up, so essential items must be available to grab if forgotten earlier. Puzzles should advance the story. Real time is bad drama, so don't time a game based on real time. Different players play at different speeds. There's incremental rewards, arbitrary puzzles, so puzzle solutions need to make sense. There's reward intent, so objects that need to be found need to be clear to the player. So for example, think of a mailbox versus just a regular box. You need to make a clear distinction between the two, even though the two have the same word box in it. There's unconnected events, so sections of games are locked until the player achieves certain tasks, and you must give the player options.
You can see right away in the first Monkey Island, especially the making the goals clear, which is something that was not always Sierra's strength with King's Quest. In the first King's Quest game, you're sort of plopped down outside the castle, and you have to go into the castle to talk to the king to learn basically what your goal is. And then even then, you don't have any specific instructions on how to go about achieving those goals. You contrast that from the very start of the first Monkey Island, right after Guybrush says, "My name is Guybrush Threepwood and I want to be a pirate." The person he's talking to says, if you want to be a pirate, you should go to the scum bar and talk to the pirate leaders. And then you go there, you talk to them, they give you the next steps you should take. The other thing about like arbitrary items, arbitrary puzzles, Monkey Island makes fun of that with items such as the rubber chicken with the pulley in the middle.
When am I ever possibly going to use this? Is the flavor text, and then
you do use the pulley, and it should be pretty clear when you get to the item that needs the pulley why you need the pulley. And then separately later, you do need a chicken. But the fact that it is a rubber chicken with a pulley in the middle as one item is just humorously arbitrary.
Yes. So the game was a relatively decent hit, but critically, the game was phenomenal. And it's looked back as a groundbreaking adventure game.
The game reviewer Yahtzee from Zero Punctuation said if adventure games were a country, he would put Monkey Island on the $1 bill.
From the success, Lucasfilm Games, which is now known as LucasArts as of 1990, went forward to create the sequel, Monkey Island 2: LeChuck's Revenge, released in December 1991. For Ron Gilbert, he was hoping the game franchise would accumulate into a trilogy and had planned for a sequel while Secret of Monkey Island was still in production. The sequel was critically received well, like the first game, but only sold about 25,000 copies, and the game was considered a flop.
No, and not the don't lose money rule coming back.
Yeah. For Gilbert, he never went on to complete his trilogy, and he left LucasArts in 1992.
Puzzle-wise, in my opinion, that is the tightest adventure game ever made.
LeChuck's Revenge?
Yeah, like, once you figure them out, they make so much sense, and you have to constantly switch between 3 islands, because each island has an item that you need on one of the other 2 islands to complete a puzzle. It's just so satisfying to play. LeChuck's Revenge just nails the play feel of adventure games.
It also is the first, but not the last Monkey Island game that offered 2 difficulty modes, where you could play either the full version or the light version with fewer puzzles. For instance, you would go in regular mode, and you'd go to a place, and then you'd have to solve 3 more puzzles to get the item you need there. But then in light mode, you just go to the place, and the item you need is just there.
Can I go on a tiny quick tangent of how it accidentally broke Ron Gilbert's rules of adventure games?
Sure, yeah.
So there's a bit where you need a wrench to continue. At a certain point, you acquire a monkey, and you have to know, oh, a monkey wrench, I get it. And it's kind of in your inventory posed sort of like a wrench to kind of help you with that. Monkey wrench is only a United States of America term, not even in Canada.
Really?
No one else in the entire world calls it a monkey wrench.
Interesting.
I was not aware of that.
They were not aware of that, and they got so many complaints that no one could solve it, and when they did solve it, the solution made no sense.
At the risk of turning this into how did this not get played, there have been many times over the years that Ron Gilbert has alluded to what his third Monkey Island game would be. And over the years, his view on the third game has changed to the point where a handful of years ago, he wrote a blog post if he were to do Monkey Island 3, what it would be. And at the time, he said, look, I'm probably never making another Monkey Island game because Disney doesn't want to do anything with it. At the time, he thought he would never make another Monkey Island game. But he had all these things he would include in it. But the last point he made was that it wouldn't be the same Monkey Island 3 I was going to make in 1992 because I'm a different person now than I was then.
Yeah.
The departure of Ron Gilbert from Lucasfilm, from everything I can tell, mostly just amounted to he wanted to do his own thing. He started Humongous Entertainment. The culture at Lucasfilm Games, the culture at LucasArts wasn't the same freewheeling fun culture it used to be now that there was more money and more people involved.
Yeah.
And so he wanted to go off and do his own thing. But that departure created such a schism in the fan base because, schisms in the fan base of Lucasfilm properties once the original creator leaves, that would just never happen again.
If you actually delve deep into like forums and see people discussing this, there are people that just absolutely reject everything that happened with the franchise after LeChuck's Revenge. And me, Curse of Monkey Island, the third one, and Tales of Monkey Island, the fifth one, are my favorites. So, I am terrified to encounter those people. And in some of Dave's videos, when he talks about Monkey Island, he sounds haunted by ever having to.
There were flame wars. Part of the issue was that the ending of Monkey Island 2 ends with this sort of twist upon twist upon twist punchline that some fans took way more seriously than others. When the subsequent games dealt with that twist in a different way than those fans thought it should be dealt with, a lot of fans came to the mindset that anything Ron didn't make was not canon. Even though Ron said that he liked Curse of Monkey Island, he thought it was a great game. He said, it's not the game I would have made, but I thought it was a good game. The character Murray, the talking skull, is introduced in Curse of Monkey Island, and Ron has gone on the record many times that Murray is one of his favorite characters in the series, even though he comes from the games that he did not make. Eventually, when Ron was given another chance, he did not end up making his Monkey Island 3. He just made his Monkey Island 6.
Yeah. As for the Monkey Island series, it wouldn't continue until 5 years later with The Curse of Monkey Island. The original title was actually The Pirate Curse of Monkey Island. It was under the direction of Jonathan Ackley and Larry Ahern. Ahern was the only one that previously worked as an artist and animator for Monkey Island 2.
Well, I think this is probably going to be the end of this episode on Monkey Island. Thank you, everybody, so much for listening. Thank you for joining us on this excursion. If you're a new listener who just was Googling Monkey Island movie and we came up, thanks for the listen. I feel like that's how we get a lot of our downloads. David Gansel, where can people find more of your work?
People can find more of my work on the internet. All of my links are at doggans.com, DOGGANS.com. Links to whichever social media accounts still exist by the time this podcast is out. I also do a podcast with my wife on Patreon at Home with the Dogginses, where I've talked about Monkey Island a couple times. My wife has not played the game, so those episodes are basically just me explaining things to her. On my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Doggins, I've got a couple Monkey Island videos and a couple Monkey Island live streams that feature Charlie Marlowe here.
Is that podcast with your wife your only podcast?
Well, as of this recording, it's my only released podcast, but I'm working on another podcast with, let me check here, Charlie Marlowe, as well as Ella. We are working on a Gallivant rewatch podcast.
Ooh. Is it still coming? I haven't heard any updates about this in a while.
That's because we are all busy people and easily distracted people, but it is still in the works. We're off on a secret mission. A Gallivant rewatch podcast is happening someday.
Hey, speaking of other things that Charlie is working on, is anything else you would like to plug, Charlie?
I am now making an abridged series of the Zelda cartoon called Well Abridge Me Princess, which can be found at wellabridgemeprincess.tumblr.com, where I voice Link and Zelda and Dave voices the head of the Moblins. There's an associated Twitch with the Zelda Abridged series where I am an 80s cartoon Link VTuber. A VTuber is the webcam tracks your movement and translates it to an animated character. And so I play video games Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and that gets interpreted by the output as the, well, excuse me, Princess Link playing video games, and that is at twitch.tv/wellx, the letter X, excuse me.
If you want to find any of those links, we're going to have those in the episode description. If you want to find out more about this podcast and our other podcasts, you can go check out our website, pipedreampodcasts.com, which is also the home of Come On Fugu Pods, Pod Made You Special, Escape from Vault Disney, and the Mystery Shack Look Back. While you're there, you can also find links to our social media pages. We're on Twitter at HDTNGM. We're on Instagram at How Did This Not Get Made. I say this every week that those are really, really excellent follows as a companion to this, especially this week because I want you to see all of the awesome artwork that we were looking at here. Dan does an amazing job at posting concept art or other visual pieces that go along with the episode that we are talking about. There's a lot of podcast social media pages that are just there to like notify you when there's a new episode out. How Did This Not Get Made is a good follow, and it's like, honestly, you're missing a part of the podcast unless you're seeing some of the stuff that Dan posts on those pages. You can also send us your emails, notgetmade@gmail.com, with any corrections or additions or suggestions for future projects. We also have a Patreon page that supports this show, as well as Come On Fugu Pods and Pod Made You Special. At that Patreon page, we have all kinds of perks, including ad-free versions of all of our shows, access to all of Dan's notes and sources, which sometimes there's some really fun articles that Dan shares in there that you can go into some really cool stories to get some more info about what we're talking about. And we have a button club where you get a cool, awesome button mailed to you. All of those links can be found at our website, pipedreampodcasts.com. That's going to go ahead and wrap up this episode. Thank you, everybody, so much for listening.
Thank you.